Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're exploring prayer. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. There is a fantastic short story that somebody told me in the library of YU. I think one of the reasons why I remember it is because I was so enchanted with the author's name. Many of you may be familiar with him. It's the famous author Jorge Borge. I think I'm pronouncing that name correctly, though if I didn't hear somebody else pronounce it, I never would have thought that that is in fact how it's pronounced. And the story, which is one of his most popular, he's a really phenomenal thinker, philosopher, one of the unique thinkers to live in the last 100 years. He died in 1986. And Jorge Borge has this story called Funes the Memorious. Funes the Memorious is a story about a person named Ireneo Funes, who I believe gets into some horse riding accident, and because of the accident gets hit on the head, he is able to remember everything, does not forget a thing. And the story is really a rumination about a world where there is no forgetting. What would life be like if we never forgot everything, if we always had access to all information? This is actually not just a case in science fiction. There was a real life story that was actually carried out by a neuropsychologist named Alexander Luria, who wrote a book about his interactions. I'm curious from listeners if Alexander Luria is related to the famous Luria family. I assume that he is in some way, but I don't really know much about his Jewish roots. But he wrote an actual book about his interviews with a client, with a patient. I'm going to butcher his name. I believe he was also Jewish. His name was Solomon Sharashevsky. Solomon Sharashevsky was somebody who did not forget, was able to remember everything. And in the book, which Luria published later on, I think in 1968, which is called The Mind of a Numenist, he talks about what would it be like to literally not forget. And one of the things that always stuck with me is that both in Borge's story, Funes the Memorious, and in Luria's The Mind of the Numenist, they both highlight the same thing, and that is, if you remember everything and you do not forget anything, it actually hinders conceptual thought. Part of conceptual thought, part of being able to kind of group different categories together and form these broader concepts, is hindered if you do not forget. If you do not forget, every single thing that you learn is kind of in its own category, and drawing those connections becomes nearly impossible. And in both The Mind of the Numenist and in Funes the Memorious, both subjects in the fictional story and in the non-fiction story, The Mind of the Numenist, the protagonist in each of those stories complains about the fact that they're unable to actually generalize and create conceptual thought. In the words of Borge from Funes the Memorious, he writes, "To think is to forget a difference, to generalize, to abstract. In the overly replete world of Funes, there were nothing but details." Nothing but details. And the reason why I'm beginning with this is because I think in our contemporary world where we have Google at our fingertips, we now have AI at our fingertips, we're able to offload so much of our memory, so much of what, we use brain capacity to remember, where is this? And we offload so much of that. So what exactly are we left with? How has AI and the digitization of Torah learning affected the way that we relate to knowledge, and more specifically to Torah knowledge? I'm actually quite worried about this. I see this with my own students. I have found that the way that we compile and share Torah very often is just here's 20 sources that more or less are saying the same thing, and we have these source sheets that get gobbled up in a lot of details, but I think a lot of the essential conceptual ideas of being able to bring in new creative ideas to Talmud Torah, to the study of Torah, has in many ways been hindered. I'm trying to think in the last, 50 years, what incredible creative works of Torah have come out. And people have criticized me for bringing this up. I've brought this up online. I'm sure you could come up with examples for you that work. But frankly, I am worried that the digitization of Torah has actually actually hindered creativity. We should have seen a flowering of creativity, and instead, most of our published works just focus on gathering all the sources together, what's become almost unnecessary with the advent of computers. And what really excites me are thinkers who are drawing new conceptual pathways, new doorways, new entry points into the engagement of Torah. And that is exactly what this episode is about, how the world of AI will affect the world of Torah. How will our religious knowledge, namely Torah, the religious worldview that we construct in our minds through sources, through the immersion in Torah, in Gemara, in all of the fine works that have come afterwards, how does not forgetting anything, so to speak, the world that all of us live in, we all have all of Torah at our fingertips. So where do we have room to grow, to build, to be creative? How do we make sure that we do not suffer the fate of Funes the Memorious and just see details without that cadence and rhythm of conceptual thought? Because ultimately what makes us human more than anything, and this is an argument of Douglas Hofstadter in his fantastic book, Surfaces and Essences, Analogy as the Fuel and Fire of Thinking. Douglas Hofstadter, which I mentioned in an earlier episode within this series, is the author, of course, of Gödel Escher Bach. He won the Pulitzer Prize for that. His student David Chalmers is one of the forerunners of academic thought on consciousness, and Douglas Hofstadter, after writing Gödel Escher Bach, wrote a phenomenal book called Surfaces and Essences, Analogy as the Fuel and Fire of Thinking, where he talks about conceptual thinking, drawing distinctions and parallels between different categories, creating analogies in our own life to the things that we learn is actually the very engine, the very root of what makes us most human. The ability to draw those analogies in our creative thinking is actually at the very heart of what makes human knowledge distinctly human. And in a world where we feel sometimes that we're trying to keep up with the breadth of AI, the breadth of what computers offers, maybe our eyes should be diverted in something else. Maybe the pinnacle of human knowledge is something other than remembering everything, than knowing everything, than having everything at your fingertips, so to speak, but instead developing a cadence to your knowledge, learning how to integrate the knowledge that you have into your life, drawing analogies and building new doorways and entry points into existing knowledge. And I think in many ways the opportunities of having so much information at our fingertips only creates exciting possibilities for what Torah means, for what religious life means, so long as we get out of the rat race with computers and divert our attention to what makes us essentially human and figuring out how to apply that both to the world of Torah knowledge and of course to the world of tefillah. And that is why I'm so excited to share our conversation today with Dr. Moshe Koppel, who is a returning guest. Now, I want to surface something. When we announced this series, a few people, multiple people reached out and said, we have concerns that you are including Moshe Koppel in this series because of his involvement with the Kohelet Policy Forum and their role in the judicial reforms and all of the outbreak and protests that occurred in Israel because of it. Good-hearted people, very decent people. On a personal level, I bristle at the notion that a disagreement, however serious, however real, however deeply entrenched in your personal ideology, should necessitate that we can no longer have a conversation, with few exceptions. I can think of a handful of exceptions of ideologies that I would no longer be able to have in conversation. But I know Dr. Koppel personally. I know he's a decent person. And just the very notion that we can't be in dialogue on a different topic because he was involved and took a stand on something that you don't appreciate ideologically in the political realm, I really don't like that idea. And I want, the people who reach out are very good people, but you should know people reach out in every guest that we have and say, well, they've said X, Y, and Z. Are you sure you want to have them? Both people who we have on the right wing, on the left wing, on the political spectrum, on the religious spectrum, there is always someone whispering in my ear on whichever side and saying, I don't know if you should really have this person. I don't know if this is the right. And I think that if we insist upon that ideological purity, we will all be stunted because of it. I think part of the charm and beauty of what makes us human is our ability to engage and have the friction of ideas. But I did take the concern seriously, and the conversation I had with Dr. Koppel was actually recorded many, many months ago, but I reached out in advance of that conversation, parts of which were actually published in Jewish Action's quarterly magazine, the quarterly magazine of the OU. But before I release that conversation and we get into that, I actually reached out to him more recently and spoke to him, should we be concerned about your involvement? How do you want the listeners to think about that? So let's begin with my introductory conversation with Dr. Moshe Koppel. So I am so excited to really begin my interview with Moshe Koppel with an additional interview with Moshe Koppel. And the reason why I thought this was necessary that was because in the months since we first recorded this interview, when you were on a trip, we had a lovely time together in Lower Manhattan. We were talking about developments in Israel and AI and computer science. I've always been enamored with your work, but since then, your name has been associated with things far beyond our conversations in AI or our initial conversation that we had you on for 1840 regarding Halacha, and that is your role in judicial reform. And I wanted to begin, we're not going to unpack what happened with the judicial reform, but for a lot of people who connected to your work regarding Halacha, regarding computer science, I'll be blunt, I know people who I respect and I love who were so deeply disappointed that they saw you getting involved in something that nearly, in their eyes, caused the civil war in Israel. And I wanted to kind of begin the interview with, what would you tell people who felt that disappointment? Maybe they were viewing it from too distant a lens, but they don't associate you with that type of activity or politics. Can we separate your work? Should we be separating your work from the judicial reform? What would your response be to people who were hurt by what they saw your suggestions regarding the Israeli judicial reform and their larger relationship with your work and ideas?
Okay, so first let me explain that I have a think tank in Israel called Kohelet, the Kohelet Policy Forum. We don't do politics, we do policy, okay? Policy means, well, what are the right policies for the state to have, right? We don't get involved in the matter of political parties and what sacrifices they need to make in order to appeal to their base and get reelected, or their coalition politics and things like that. That is not what we do. What we do is write policies. So in fact, the papers about judicial reform are papers that we wrote, actually, some of them, 7, 8 years ago. We didn't actually do anything lately. All that happened lately is that some politicians liked our work and used it as a basis for judicial reforms. Now, policy is not the same thing as computer science or mathematics, okay? In math, you prove a theorem, and if you have a correct proof, well, it's right. In computer science, sometimes you prove theorems, sometimes you design an algorithm and you can show empirically that your algorithm actually works effectively and does something. Policy isn't like that. First of all, people disagree about what it is they're trying to achieve, and secondly, they can disagree about how you can get there, right? So what we want to have in Israel is we want to have a vibrant democracy, a society in which people have, all the basic freedoms, a Jewish country, right? And the question is, how do you reconcile all these things? What are the right, for example, in this case, what are the right checks and balances between the branches of government in order to achieve that? So we wrote papers explaining what we thought were the problems with the Israeli system and how we thought adjustments could be made in order to get the right checks and balances. It doesn't seem to me like the kind of thing, where people should, hate me for it. You could disagree with me or not disagree with me. But, the idea that some people who opposed the particular policies that we advocated for, or to be more precise, who opposed the judicial reforms that politicians brought that were based on the policies that we designed, well, okay, you could disagree, but that doesn't seem, the fact that they kind of held me up as the demon in order to...
Moshe, allow me to interrupt.
Yeah.
I hope I'm not the first person who is coming and saying, oh, I know of people who felt...
No, you're not. I mean, there are people who tell me this to my face, so it's not, like, I was at a wedding last week and some woman came over to me and said, you're a Nazi, and then things got worse from there. Yeah, I know that there are people who feel strongly about this, but the fact that people are so easily swayed by what they read that they would relate to me personally in a negative way because I am the head of a think tank that wrote policy papers, which they never read, okay, and they don't know what's in it, and they haven't contended with the argument. I mean, there are plenty of people who understand these issues who came to me and said, well, we disagree with you for the following reason, and said, well, we think you're not going to achieve the goals that we both want to reach doing this. And I said, fine, let's see how we can make adjustments. And, we discussed ways of making it better. It's not like I think that everything we wrote in any position paper over the last 10 years in Kohelet is absolutely perfect and nobody could disagree. But the fact that people read things in the newspaper and then hold me up as a demon, or even worse, like use me as part of their virtue signaling, well, that's kind of disappointing. What can I say? I mean, it doesn't increase my respect for them, but so be it. I have to live with it.
I'm just curious, just almost like friend to friend. I have a very hard time when my name is being used and I'm not in control of the narrative, particularly, and this has happened to me fairly recently, when people look at work that I've done and they feel betrayed. Maybe it was an interview that took place in 1840 or something I wrote or something I said, and they said, we disagree so strongly that we feel a sense of betrayal. And it has a very real personal effect on me because, again, I'm a people pleaser. I love being liked. I guess it's a human condition. I'm curious, just on a personal level, how did you cope when you were like really a part of an international news story?
Yeah, it's not fun. As I said to you, earlier, I said I'd be delighted to have my anonymity back, but that's not going to happen. What's important to me is that the people that really are my friends and my family, of course, and people that I have great respect for, they trust me. And even if they disagree with me, they'll say, well, we disagree for this reason or for that reason. And there's no person in the world with whom I agree on every single topic, right? But it doesn't have to be the end of the world if you disagree about something. The fact that you disagree with me about the exact composition of the Judicial Selection Committee and whether there should be 6 representatives of the coalition or 5 representatives of the coalition, I mean, okay, that doesn't sound to me like the kind of thing that if we disagree about, we can never talk again for the rest of our lives, just like, we just can't get past it. I think we can get past it.
And that is my hope as well, which is why, obviously we're going to be sharing this interview, though we've already shared snippets of it in the pages of Jewish Action. I will continue to read your work. I agree with you very often, especially for people like myself who want to be everything to everyone all at once, to paraphrase the title of that great recent movie. Being everything to everyone all at once is difficult, and it becomes nearly impossible to share ideas in the public square. There are people who criticize me for, writing in this platform or in this place. It could be debilitating, and I hope that your ideas, and whichever ones people are attracted to, people continue to give them attention and credence on the merits, on whether or not it resonates. But I have met with you, we have broken bread together, and I can attest to the fact that you are not, in fact, as far as I can tell, a demon. As far as I can tell.
David, that's how the demons work. They're so clever.
They're so clever. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he doesn't exist. It was so incredibly generous of him to jump on. I can vouch for the fact that as much as you disagree with him, and as serious as those disagreements may be, he's a person of decency and integrity, and somebody who is thinking constantly about not only computer science, but specifically Torah. His book, which we discussed when we had him on last time during our Halacha series, called Meta Halacha, is absolutely fantastic. It actually talks about a lot of the principles of computer science and thinking about the ways that we think about halachic axiology, how we build the halachic system. Is that the same as kind of programming a computer? Is that different? And factoring in, our own humanity into the halachic system plays a big role in what we talk about. Here is our original conversation recorded many months ago. I am delighted to share our conversation with Dr. Moshe Koppel. Moshe.
Yeah. No, you have to start with, it is my absolute pleasure.
So you know.
If you don't say it's my absolute pleasure, I'm not talking.
It is my absolute pleasure. We've had a few returning guests before, but it really is my absolute pleasure to welcome you back in conversation to talk about the world of artificial intelligence. And I know when I think of artificial intelligence, what comes to mind? I'm always thinking about movies. I'm thinking about Space Odyssey. I'm thinking about robots coming to life and taking over Earth. But I'm also thinking about AI, I'm thinking about writing on Gmail and when it's able to fill it and know how my sentence is going to end. So I guess as a starting point, I want to understand and really build definitions. What exactly does it mean when we talk about the term artificial intelligence?
Okay, so the truth is it's an unfortunate term. What happened was that in the early days of computers, back in the 50s, the kinds of things that computers were obviously designed to do and do on a regular basis is kind of boring things like, sorting things in order, right? Alphabetizing or searching for something, right? You're looking for a particular item in a long list. And that's kind of the bread and butter of what computers do. Of course, they do it in more sophisticated ways. When you combine all these operations, they do a lot of important and interesting things. And in 1956, there was a conference in Dartmouth, which is, widely regarded as like the founding of artificial intelligence. And the idea was that we were going to try to get computers to do not the kinds of boring things that one imagines computers do, but rather the kinds of things that you associate with people doing, right? So the kinds of things, they were talking about then were game playing. So could you get a computer to be a chess champion, right?
Yeah. And at that point, I remember it was considered almost unimaginable that
right.
a
It was a
computer
big
would be
deal
as good
then. Exactly.
as a human being.
Correct.
Why is there a difference between searching for an item, alphabetizing, and playing a game? It's interesting that, at this conference, it's like, can we get computers to play a game? As that is tricky. What is it about games that would make it more difficult for a computer to master?
Well, it's not fundamentally different, but if you think about sorting things in order or searching for things, there are lots of ways to do it. You yourself can figure out what needs to be done. It's just that it takes a long time. If you need to order thousands of things,
I know
right?
it goes A, B, C.
Exactly.
But it's a whole, yeah.
Once you know the principle, then the interesting research was how can we do it most efficiently, right? But with the kinds of things like, playing chess, you need to really think through how you could even get a computer to be good at chess, right? It's not obvious what the right technique is, right?
This is 1956.
This is in 56. Yeah,
Okay.
56, there was a paper written by a guy named Samuels. He was a Jewish guy who had gotten a computer to play checkers fairly decently. That's where it began. And, as you know, eventually they got to chess, which is a much more complicated game.
I was a kid during Deep Blue.
Right. So Deep Blue.
Beating Kasparov. It was
Exactly.
a whole, yeah.
So at some point in the 90s, chess programs became better than grandmasters.
Yes.
Now are clearly the best in the world, certain programs for chess. But Go, even when a computer became the world champion of chess, the Chinese game of Go was regarded as way more complicated than chess.
I've never heard of that game before.
Okay, well, you remember Chinese checkers when you were a kid? Yeah. It's kind of like that.
Okay.
It's a little bit more complicated. But that game was regarded as, no, we can do chess, but we're never going to be a world champion at Go. And the reason they thought so was you can calculate the number of possible moves, right? So in chess, it's a zillion trillion moves. And Go, the number of possible moves was a zillion trillion times bigger than the number of possible moves in chess. So they thought this is unconquerable because really what are you doing? You're thinking about what are the possible moves that you can make. You're trying to take a path down the different possible moves, and you're trying to maximize your own strength and minimize your opponent's strength, right?
But bring it back to the foundational question, which is,
Right.
Is all of this artificial intelligence?
Yes. The truth of the matter is if you ask somebody, okay, where is the boundary line between what we call artificial intelligence and what we call just computer programming, there's not a big red line between them, okay? So in a very colloquial sense, the kind of stuff that people do, if you can get computers to do them as well or better than people, that's what they call artificial intelligence.
You see people using these chat bots.
Chat GPT.
Chat GPT. And you can ask it to do a prompt, and there are people prompting it, write a sermon for the Parsha in the voice of this rabbi.
Yes.
And they'll really come up with something new and innovative and be able to imitate a voice.
Just to clarify for your readers, when you say voice, you mean in the writing style.
Exactly. It doesn't sound like...
It's not spoken. You get back an output in text.
Correct.
But you can actually say, give me something on the Parsha like in gangster rap.
Exactly. And they'll really be able to do it.
Yeah, it's insane, but they actually can do it. Yeah.
So when you see this now, what are the general trends that you see coming in how AI is going to revolutionize the world of Torah study?
Okay, there are many different areas in which it can do that. Let's focus, first of all, on things like text processing, how you handle rabbinic texts, okay? Because, one could imagine all kinds of virtual reality things things for doing korbanot, right?
Like you could put on a headset and you're in the base
Put
of
in a headset and you're in the base of
Mikdash.
Mikdash. I don't want to talk. I want to talk more about what we can do with the kind of texts that people who are studying Torah usually are reading, and how we can help them. And there are basically three different areas in which you would use artificial intelligence for this kind of purpose. The first one is just to make Torah more accessible to people, right? So this is not the kind of thing that an expert would need, but something that just makes it easier. So for example, you can take any sefer at all. First of all, take a printed book and using what's called OCR, optical character recognition.
Which people may know, anytime that you take a PDF and you turn it into a Word document, it's using OCR technology, right?
Correct. So the idea is if you take a picture of an old sefer, right? Now, it's just a picture. You can't search that, right? It's just a picture. It's like, as far as the computer is concerned, it's black dots and white dots, all right?
Yeah.
You can't find a word that way. So the first thing you need to do is convert that picture of a page into a sequence of actual words so that the computer knows what the words are, right?
And especially in old print, that gets harder and harder.
Exactly.
It's not as clear.
So that's called OCR, and what's being done right now, I can tell you this because it's being done in my lab in Israel, which is called Dicta. We're now able to take pictures of a book that was printed in the 19th century in some horrible, Rashi font that's really hard to
close together.
Yeah, exactly. Choppy and just more spaces and less spaces and all kinds of weird stuff going on the page. And, old-fashioned letters sometimes, to OCR that to an accuracy of 99 point something percent. So
and that's already in existence.
That already exists.
We're there.
We're there, yes.
Okay.
And the next thing you could do, just talking about making text more accessible to people, is you could put the nikud into a text, right? The vocalization, right? The nikudot. It's hard for some people to read a sefer that doesn't have the nikudot in it, right? Because words are ambiguous, right?
I remember when we first started learning Talmud, I think in 5th or 6th grade, I believe the top class, which I don't want to brag, I was in 5th or 6th grade, I think we had to draw in the nikudos, but I think the other class had a special Gemara that only existed on a handful of chapters in the whole Talmud that had the nikudos inside of the Talmud.
Right, that's pre-Steinsaltz.
Yes.
The idea is now, for Steinsaltz to put in the nikudot, that was a lot of effort. That was done manually. Somebody went through it and actually did it. But what you could do now, using some ideas from artificial intelligence, is you could take a new text that has never been seen by the computer, and without any manual intervention, just using automatic means, you can actually put in all the nikudot.
Give me an example of a book you did this with, a sefer.
Okay, we've done it on hundreds of books, but I'll just take one that's particularly interesting because if you looked at it, you go, oh my God, this is taking my eyes out. Okay, if you take the Avkat Rochel. The Avkat Rochel are the Tshuvos of the Beis Yosef. The version of the Avkat Rochel that's out there was actually, it was printed originally, I think, in 1865 or something.
They did retypeset it, though, but that's more recently?
I don't know if they retypeset it. I have a version that came out a few decades ago, which is just a photo offset. It's basically, they didn't reset the book.
Yeah.
Okay, now there might be another more modern version.
But you took the old photo.
We took the old one, right?
Yeah.
We took the old one, scan it in, just scan the book in, and then OCR it. And the OCR is very accurate. By the way, we know more or less where there's uncertainty.
There are certain words when you're learning Gemara. The difference between hacha, hasam, hachi. You get certain words, Talmudic words mixed up. What does the computer get tripped up on?
What the computer gets tripped up on is not similar concepts, but similar letters. It's when a resh and a dalet, or a beis and a chaf.
A hey and a ches.
And a hey and a ches, just they happen to be letters that look very similar. So you can do all kinds of tricks. And of course, we do all these tricks, which is, well, if it's a hey, then it's a word that we have in our dictionary. We have a dictionary of all the words in the language. So if you're not sure if it's a hey or a ches, well, then you can
look it up.
You could check both ways.
The you in that sentence is the computer.
The computer, yeah. The computer will actually look it up in a word list and give preference to a word that's in the word list.
So on the first level is OCR. That is a fascinating possibility, and that's already, it's not a possibility.
It's
that exists.
Yeah.
It's exciting to me. My brain did not explode.
Right. Your brain didn't explode. Wait. So now, the next thing you do is you put in the nikudot.
Super helpful.
Yes. That's working. We've got
that running.
We got it running. Yeah.
The next thing you do is you add punctuation, right? If you're looking at the Avkat Rochel, right, this book in this horrible old print, well, there's no punctuation in there. There's like these very long paragraphs.
There are very few Sfarim that had any punctuation.
Exactly. So there's
just periods. They weren't.
There's just periods, and those are few and far between.
Yes.
Right.
A lot of run-on sentences.
A lot of run-on sentences.
Copy editor reading rabbinic literature.
If you look at the Igros Moshe, he can write a 5-page tshuva in a single sentence.
Yes.
It's astonishing. Now, it's really hard to do this. First of all, in the Nikud, one is right and one is wrong. I mean, there are rare instances where there are two possibilities and you're uncertain which is actually right.
I'm actually intrigued just for a moment. I know that it wasn't real polemics, but there were always battles over how to pronounce certain, even mesechtas, certain words. Yes. In yeshiva, there's a word that appears many times in the Talmud about an argument. So some people will pronounce it b'mai kamiflagi.
Right.
And the
kamifalgi.
Exactly.
Yes.
Kamifalgi. Or there's a mesechta called erchin. And it is properly enunciated Arachin,
yes.
Right? Or Menachos is probably more correct, Minchaos, correct? No, that I made up.
You made that one up.
I made the last one up. But I remember even Rosh Yeshiva getting annoyed about the smarty pants students.
Doing it correctly.
Doing it correct. Because a lot of that comes down to language.
Right.
The rules for punctuation, can they be overruled if the common spoken...
Right. As you know, I'm a big fan of evolving language.
Yes.
And
it gets into that question,
if that's
right?
how people... Yes.
Descriptivist versus prescriptivist language.
Correct. But, for example, like I have a guy on staff who is my official vocalizer. He's the Nikud guy, right?
Yes.
And he's the guy who resolves like these questions. He's a Hasidic guy, okay? But he wants to get it right.
He knows the rules.
He knows the rules. But here's the thing. He wants to do it right. Now, he worked for another major publisher of Gemara with Nikudot, okay? He said that he did the Nikud for their Gemara. And they said to him, no, you can't do that. We don't care about your fancy pants correct rules, okay? If the Olam says it like this incorrectly, we want you to vocalize it incorrectly. Okay, they wanted it to be the way the Olam does it, right? For us, he actually did it according to the rules. I want to get the most accuracy I can squeeze out of the system, where your gold standard is, whatever your gold standard is.
But take me to the next level now.
Okay, first of all, on this accessible thing, so there's Nikudot, there's punctuation, and there's one more thing, which is opening abbreviations. If you see...
I love abbreviation games. Because there are ones that are very obscure.
Some of them are really hard, Some of them are
an
hard.
abbreviation, like an acronym, which are all over rabbinic literature. Let's give a very famous acronym. What's a famous Talmudic acronym?
Kaf Hey Gimel, right? That could either be Kahai Gavna or it could be Kohen Gadol.
Exactly.
Right? There's a very good example, and you need to be able to distinguish between them. Now, we have this very advanced AI system that's able to figure out, based on context, what is actually the correct opening up of an abbreviation. Now, once you're able to do this, you can go back and look at other books, and you can check whether they got it right or wrong. You can find amazing mistakes.
They got what wrong? There were other books that tried to open up.
They opened up abbreviations, right?
And did it wrong.
So, for example...
Did you ever catch mistakes?
Yaakov Avinu Am Haaretz. Okay, that's pretty bad. Can you figure out what
Olav
it was?
Hashalom.
Olav Hashalom, right?
Was there really a work that published Yaakov Avinu Am Haaretz?
Yes, I'm not going to tell you who, but yes.
That's fantastic.
Right.
So all of this is kind of setting the stage and making it more accessible, more easy, more approachable, the text.
Right. But now, what about scholars?
Next?
Yeah, okay, so scholars want something that's actually... A scholar doesn't need the Nikudot.
Well, you're presuming something when you say scholars want. What I'm curious, and I don't want you to answer this now. First, I want you to tell me what this is about. I'm not sure scholars want this, because I don't think scholars want to be replaced.
Yes.
We'll get there.
You're making a valid point.
What's the next level?
Okay, the next level is I have a text, a book-length text. I want to know every place where this book is actually based on an earlier source. I want to identify that source, and I want to link to it, okay?
Yes. This exists when you search on Bar-Ilan almost, no? And
It's manually, they manually put in a lot of this stuff. And only like to Gemaras or to Psukim.
Correct.
Now, I'm talking about, you're learning, the Chidushei Ramban, and he has quoted a Sifra or a Sifri or a Gemara or a Medrash or a Rishon that came before him or Gaonim. He's quoting tons of things. Every single time there's a quote there that exists in an earlier source, I want to put in a footnote And the footnote is going to say, this is a Gemara in Psachim, and you click on it and it opens up the Gemara in Psachim for you, right? But it's not just that. There are people who are quoting the Ramban subsequently, right? So if I'm learning a line in the Ramban and I want to know every single Achron, every single
Later commentator,
right, who has quoted this particular piece of the Ramban, right, I'm going to get it. And not only am I going to show you for every single play, it could be 20 times on a page, right? Not only am I going to show you all of these things, but if you're interested actually in knowing the different ways the Ramban has been quoted, how did people quote this line slightly differently from each other? Maybe Rav Moshe Feinstein brought it in, in a responsum, he quoted it one way, but if we look at the Minchas Yitzchak, he quoted it slightly differently, right? And I'll actually put it in what's called a synoptic form, where you compare all the different versions and the differences are highlighted. So that's something that's of interest to scholars.
Because it really shows you the depth of the text, everything that preceded it and everything that's built upon it.
Exactly.
And that exists.
And that exists as well.
Okay. Take me to the future.
So now let me take you to the present, but that's even more science fiction than this, which is you're learning some sefer, an actual physical book. You now take a picture of it with your phone. You open up the phone to illuminate.dicta.org.il. You take a picture of it. Your phone now tells you, I'll tell you what that is. What you've just seen in the book is the Chidushei Harashba on Chulin on Daf Daled Amud Aleph. And now let me give you the whole thing in digital form. You've got the book and this is what you're learning now, but you want to get it all in digital form so that you can search it, so that you can, at the push of a button, add the nikud.
This is like Shazam. There's an app where if you listen to a song and just play like 3 seconds of a song, I'll tell you what song you're listening to and all the information related to it, who published it, etc., what album's it on. So this is Shazam for Torah.
Exactly. Let me just tell you just one use case that my brother-in-law happened to mention to me the other day. You're making a source sheet, right? Now, when you're making a source sheet, if you have to use a picture from a book, it's always awkward. This is the font you want, and right? You could just take your phone now, take a picture of that, get it back in a digital form, and now you can change the font. And
That's
you
so
can
interesting.
Put stuff in, cut stuff out.
I want to tell you something. You're not going to like this, but I'm not one of the leaders in AI, but I am one of the leaders in source sheet manufacturing.
Right.
And there is a debate about, do we like source sheets that has everything in a uniform font on the page?
Right.
Or do you want the picture that has a little bit more of the personality and character?
Right.
And I'm sure it will come as no surprise that I actually like the pictures. It's a little messier. It's not as clean.
Right.
But I always say, I never want my source sheets to look like Bar-Ilan and a printer had a baby together.
Right.
I want a little personality in there.
No, I know you want. You want that personality. I
Yes.
mean, you're a Tzura Sadaf guy probably too, right?
And I want you to know something about that. Tzura Sadaf, meaning the way the page is laid out, has been fairly consistent for many works. When the Mesivta Talmud, Oz V'Hadar Mesivta Talmud, changed the Tzuras Hadaf of the Rif and the Ran, I said, I'm out.
You're out.
Stop buying them.
It's not just the Gemara for you. You want everything.
I was furious because I used to learn when I was in Yeshiva. I learned Gemara, Rashi, Tosos, Rif, Ran, Rush from the Mesechtas that had it, and I was like, "What is going on? Don't mess with that Tzur Sadaf. Like, it means something to me."
You rushed through the Ran and you ran through the Rush.
Beautiful. Yes, that is where my traditionalism is most manifest. I like the page layout. This is another area.
Okay, but now let's get to something even wilder. Okay,
Yes.
you're familiar with search engines, right?
Sure.
So you're studying a particular topic. You'll put some keywords into a search engine like Bar-Ilan or Sefaria, and you'll get a whole lot of material on that, right? But
Yes.
it's not organized in any really
they're usually
way.
either chronologically or based on...
It's either chronological or it's based on the quality of the match, which you may not care about. If you're doing, like a topic like Kol Kavua Kamertz al Mechzadami, right? It doesn't matter. It's a topic, right? Now, you don't really care whether every one of those words appears or just almost all of those words.
Sometimes it'll appear to text Kol Kavua V'chule.
V'chule, right? Yeah. What you want is to find the central texts on the topic, right? So now, the way that you would do something like that is improve search engine technology, right? This is the basic thing that you would do. You would say, wait a minute, let me give you an idea. We haven't quite implemented this yet, but it'll give you the picture of how this is supposed to be done. Let's say you put in Kol Kavua Kamertza Mechzadami, and it comes back that there's a tshuva of the Ramban on this topic, and there's Chidushei Harashba on this topic, and right? There's some basic sources that you get back just doing a regular keyword search, but that they're not totally typical. They may not be the best sources. They're certainly not comprehensive, right? But they're pretty good, right? Now, supposing that you discovered that of these sources that you found on a first pass, somebody like Rav Ovadia Yosef has quoted all three of those in the same paragraph. Right? Okay, now what do you know? You know that Rav Ovadia is clearly writing about this topic here. Even if he never used the words kol kavua, but if he quoted these three sources, then this is a paragraph that's about my topic, right? It's nice. You would add Rav Ovadia to your list, but here's where the big benefit comes in. If he quoted those three sources in that paragraph, he probably quoted a dozen other sources in that same paragraph that you had no chance of ever finding because they didn't use your keywords, right? You can now give the user all those 15 sources that Rav Ovadia quotes and be fairly confident that these are spot on because they're curated, right? I mean, they were curated by Rav Ovadia. So you can really take search up to a whole other level once you've got all of the links. In other words, if I know that these three things have all been quoted by Rav Ovadia here, right? Because I've already developed this gigantic graph that tells me who quoted who. That's what I was describing to you before. I know who's quoting. Once you know who's quoting who, and you've got this big picture of who's quoting, you can play these kinds of games with the links on the graph, which are kind of Google-like games, right? Google started this way, but in a more sophisticated way so that you can really get a picture of a sugya.
Wow.
That's what we're shooting for at the next stage.
The question that I think on a lot of people's minds, and they do it when they're playing with the chat bots, and this is what I said, the ambiguity of, do scholars really want this? Do you think a time is going to come in our lifetime where the role of the posek, of the halachic decision maker, is going to be replaced? Already now, I mean, there are some things, I don't need to call the Rav of my shul to find out what bracha to make on a bowl of Cheerios. It's already evolved, but there are things that are like contingencies where, let's say I want to know, is my knife still kosher? So there are a lot of follow-up questions that are involved in that. What did you slice with it? Or what were you washing it with? How hot was the water? Etc., etc. How many hours ago was it? Do you think in our lifetime a computer is going to be able to be taught the rules of halacha and be able to paskin shilas?
I would divide the world of shilas into two parts. I mean, it's really a continuum, but let's talk about two parts. One is, okay, what bracha do I make on a bowl of Cheerios? Or can I put a tea bag into a kli sheni on Shabbos?
And this is like the alphabetizing list. Those answers already exist in
Those
digital.
answers are out
and it's
there.
just hard to find, and a computer makes it easier to find
Exactly.
it. In our analogy. That was the first early computerizing, put things in alphabetical order.
Right.
Give me the answer to this because it's too annoying to get off my tush and get it off the shelf.
So short version is, like, with the existing technology and search engines, that is not what's existing in the labs, but the kind of stuff that's out there, whether in Safari or Bar-Ilan or Otzar Chachma or any of those, you would not be able to get the answer even to the most trivial question. Okay, you just wouldn't, because you would put in a keyword like teabag, right, or a kli sheni or something,
and I'd get 1,000 answers.
And you get 1,000 things, and spend hours just kind of sorting through
for
it
a very basic one. The computer
really
makes it more chaotic, not less.
Yeah, that's not helping much. But it's clear that not only in our lifetimes, but in short order, you're going to be able to get answers to elementary questions. Anybody who's played around with ChatGPT and seen like how astonishing it is, right, knows already at this point, you could put in probably, I haven't tried it, but you could try some very simple shilas there that are just a matter of knowing where to look in the books, right? And you'll probably get a fairly reasonable answer. I mean, I should warn you that ChatGPT is like really, really good at giving very clear and coherent answers. It's not very good at always giving true answers. That's the thing you need to worry about. You would not want to trust ChatGPT with anything that's really important, whether it's halacha or it's, anything that's really important to your life. ChatGPT is astonishing as a parlor trick, first of all, in the sense that, you say, please explain to me the idea of Nash equilibrium in game theory, right? And it will actually give you a more or less reasonable Wikipedia-like answer to it. It's amazing that it's a text generator. It's not a text copier. The paragraphs that it gives you don't actually exist anywhere, right? It has actually created them. That is an amazing, amazing thing. But you wouldn't want to rely on everything it says as being absolutely true. It tends to be way more accurate than you would have guessed is possible at this stage, right?
Sure.
But it's not 100% reliable in terms of giving truth. But we're going to get there, okay? It is clearly the case that within a few years, you will be able to ask the kind of elementary shilas about which there's not going to be any, heated arguments, right, among Rabbanim. You'll be able to get that. You'll put in a question that says, on Shabbos, can I, do this, that, or the other thing, right? Can I pour the hot water onto the cold water, right? And it'll answer it fairly well. But the fact of the matter is, that's never what Rabbanim were really for, okay? I mean, what you really need Rabbanim for are questions where
contingencies.
The Rav needs to see the person in front of him and understand, right? It's mostly like what I'd call shas hadchak issues, right?
There's a pressing circumstance with life situation.
It could be a matter of health or even life and death. It could be a matter of, it would be very expensive for me to have to do this, right?
And it's the difference if a millionaire is asking you this question or somebody who's broke, and this is going to be the difference between being able to send their kids to yeshiva.
People have, issues within their marriage
yes.
where, say, one of the couple has become less from or more from than the other one, and they need to resolve issues between them. It's a matter of shalom bayis, and they need, to know that maybe they could use a particular kula in order to save their marriage, right?
Yes.
You would not want ChatGPT answering that question. Okay?
Do you think there's going to be a future where computers are going to be able to factor in or be able to explore people's facial expressions?
For sure.
You do think there's
absolutely. There's no doubt.
So let me ask you this. Given of what's changing, do you think that the training and what the mastery that we insist upon in smicha curriculums and rabbinic ordination curriculums, should that be evolving too, in your opinion?
That's a question that I haven't really thought about. It may be the case.
Because in medicine, medical education is changing. They have to memorize a lot of stuff, but they're so much more accessible on their phones, on databases.
Correct. I think that it is important for people who are going to be paskening shilas to have very, very broad and deep knowledge of halacha, even if the material is easily accessible to them and they could look it up, just at the click of a button on their smartphone. I think it's important because knowledge develops your intuitions. And a Rav often needs to paskin on the basis of intuition because he's not going to find the particular shaila he's faced with in the Shulchan Aruch or in the Mishnah Brura or in the Igros Moshe. He's going to have strong intuitions for what's right and what's wrong. And the only way to develop strong intuitions is by having internalized a tremendous amount of information.
Let me rephrase the question. It's a different question. I'm thinking of myself. I am not the biggest Talmud Chacham. I'm not. And I know that comes as a surprise to you. I see your face. You look shocked. You look shocked. You look quite shocked.
I think you're just being modest.
No, there was an I don't know if the mics
I
don't know if the mics picked up. There was an audible gasp in the room after I said I'm not the biggest people. And I appreciate that, but I'm a vulnerable person. I'm willing to come clean and kind of really be honest right now. But I think that people have this sense, and I certainly have this, I don't want to be replaced. I want to always feel like I am able to contribute to Torah because I think a part of Torah is the human interpretation, the human partnership with the Torah's Hashem. Like the Gemara in Kiddushin, it begins as the Torah of Hashem, u'v'Torah, so your Torah, Yehege Yomim V'Layla, darshing the pasuk in Tehillim. And what I'm wondering is, what advice would you give for an emerging yeshiva student, an emerging Talmud Chacham, who's like, I see where things are headed. That massive breadth of knowledge is going to be so easily replaceable. Maybe not on Shabbos, but who knows where things are going to be headed. People always say, I'm a big Talmud Chacham, except I'm an Am Aretz on Shabbos. But what are the skills that are going to be most difficult to ever be replaced by a computer that we could be investing in?
The answer is, as I said, it's developing healthy intuition. You need to understand what's going on behind the halacha. What are the principles that underlie this whole big mass of halachas, right? What moral ideas are there, right? What's really going on, even if it's not a particular moral idea, but what are the principles of Shabbos that are going on over it? And more importantly, you need to understand people, right? A real Talmud Chacham doesn't treat somebody who's everything's going fine for them and they're wealthy and their family is happy the same as he would treat somebody who's down on their luck, who doesn't have a parnasa, who has shalom bayis problems, and they understand what each person needs. Right? You can't make up halachas. You can't do away with halachas. But there's a certain amount of give, and you need to know where is the give and where do you have to be rigid. And, what does this particular person sitting in front of me need in order to be able to flourish and live a healthy Torah life? And what does some other person need, which might be very different, right?
Your program is called Dicta Maven, and you could use some of these technologies on your phone. Can you download some of this stuff already?
Sure. Just go to dicta.org.il, and there's a whole long list of products there which you can
use.
You can use them. You can vocalize your text in there. You just put your text. As you're typing in Hebrew, it's actually putting in the nikudot.
People who have been listening to me in 1840 know that I'm always interested in pushback, in concerns, in the heresy hunters or the people who are worried about the direction. Have you gotten any concerned people reaching out to you saying, I don't like what you're doing here, or pushback saying, we got to draw a line? There's so much work now being done in AI safety to make sure that we're not literally replaced by computers.
Right.
The work of people like Eliezer Yudkowsky, who we've mentioned several times before.
Right.
Have there been people in the Torah world who are concerned about the AI Torah safety?
Interestingly enough, that hasn't been the case. I'm not one to shy away from controversy. I'm always happy for a good argument. But the fact of the matter is that we cooperate, all the stuff we're doing in Dicta, we cooperate with a lot of Haredi groups and with Sefaria, of course, and with other organizations. We really haven't gotten any pushback at all. So far, nobody has told us, we're really frightened by what you're doing. For the most part, you're just providing a service to people. If you don't want to use it, don't use it. But it's not, we haven't presumed yet to try to replace Postgame or something like that. So far, it's all been good.
Let me ask you on a personal level, do you like learning digitally, or do you?
No, I never learn from a computer. No,
You never do?
No. I open up old-fashioned Gemara and just learn from the Gemara.
The one question I didn't ask, and maybe it should have been my first question, but instead it's going to be my final question before I do rapid-fire questions.
I already told you when I wake up and go to sleep.
No, we'll
so
get there. No. But my
Yeah.
question is this. I know you in the context, we've spoken before about halacha. You've written books about halacha. What on earth qualifies you to be talking about AI?
I've been a professor of computer science for 42 years.
That's a good answer. What is your field of study that brought you to this?
Okay, so I began as a mathematician. My doctorate was on the interaction of mathematical logic and number theory. You can't get more useless than that.
I happen to be fascinated by this. I am terrible at mathematics. I love the philosophical implications of mathematics. I'm fascinated by this stuff. It happens to be.
Well, it's a fascinating topic. So eventually I kind of slowly moved more in the direction of computer science, from mathematics to computer science. Within computer science, my area is an area called machine learning. Machine learning is a branch of artificial intelligence that has more or less taken over artificial intelligence.
Is there a difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence?
Yes, artificial intelligence is this broad area where you try to get computers to do the kinds of things that usually people do.
Okay.
Now, machine learning is one method of artificial intelligence. The idea is, let's say you want to get a computer to give medical diagnoses the way a doctor does. So in the 80s, the idea was you would speak to a lot of doctors and try to figure out what's going on in their heads. And then you try to reproduce that as a computer program.
Yeah.
It never worked. One of the reasons it never worked is that a doctor kind of, you have a lot of experience, you kind of look at
It's
something
that intuition
and
that you mentioned.
you have intuition, and you go, obviously this guy has hepatitis, right?
Yeah.
And then you say, well, why?
Yeah.
And the guy just starts to mumble. I don't know. I'm looking at him, right?
Yeah.
So machine learning is where you just get tons and tons of examples, right? So to take the medical diagnosis example, you would take lots of examples where you have a patient, you know what the patient's symptoms are, and you know in the end what the correct diagnosis was. If you've got a million examples of this, now you could kind of just reconstruct the rules. You don't have to speak to the doctor. You don't have to ask him how you got to the conclusion, because the computer will itself figure out how you get from these examples to the general rule. That's the idea of machine learning. And that's what I've been working in for the last 25 years or so.
And that's been an exciting time the last 25 years.
Oh, it's been a very exciting time, right.
Give me one moment in your career, maybe it's with the Torah, where you saw a computer do something and you gasped and you said, wow, I did not think I would see this in my lifetime.
Well, that happened this week with ChatGPT, okay? I mean, I just put some questions into ChatGPT.
And you were shocked.
And I was shocked. I mean, it's jaw-dropping. I mean, you literally put in a thing and say, tell me the halachos of Kali Habishol on Shabbos and do it in the style of rap.
Or rhyme or whatever.
Rhyme
and they can
or
do
anything. It doesn't. That really is jaw-dropping. There's another thing that came out a few months ago. There's a few of these programs, Stable Diffusion and DAL E2.
Sure. Artistic programming.
You say, I'd like to have a picture of, right?
Yeah.
You know, a man jumping over the moon wearing a purple cape in the style of Rembrandt.
Correct.
You know, and it actually produces a picture like that.
No, if you ever visit my house, on almost nearly every wall are self-portraits of myself in the Rembrandt style.
Yes, that's
Our
what I would
living
expect
room,
for
it's
a
everywhere.
Talmud Chacham such as yourself. I would expect that. Yeah.
25 years from now, what's going to be? What's next?
I think that we're going to be facing the kinds of halachic questions that we really haven't thought about a lot. If you consider the use of grumma, right, of indirect action on Shabbos, right? So it comes up because places like Tzomet have wheelchairs and other things like that they use grumma as the basis for allowing certain things that people need for medical or other reasons. Now, there are very few examples of that now compared to what there's going to be 25 years from now. 25 years from now, you are going to think that you would like your driverless car to pull up in front of your house and take you somewhere. And it will do that, right? You'll have cars coming exactly when you want them to come and taking you where you want. Now, to put that more broadly, what you're really doing over there is separating actions from consequences of actions, right? What we're accustomed to now is if you want to get a certain consequence, like you want to get yourself in your car from here to there, you need to take actions. And what's forbidden on Shabbos, as far as we know, is those actions, right? You can't drive your car because of a combustion engine or whatever. But what happens when you can get the consequences? You could get you in your car from here to there without taking any of those actions, just by thought or just by pre-programming something before Shabbos, right? So now I get the consequence without the action. Do we want that to be forbidden on Shabbos as well because it's really, these are the consequences we're trying to avoid? Or is it no, it's just purely a technical matter. Mm-hmm. If you're not taking this action, then it's perfectly okay.
And this is something that Poskim will absolutely...
And people are going to have to deal with this because it's going to appear in every aspect of our lives.
Yes, a lot of very, very exciting things coming up. I always conclude my interviews with more rapid fire questions. If somebody wants to understand more about the principles of artificial intelligence, a layperson, to understand what has developed, where are we headed, is there a book you would recommend on this topic?
I don't think that books are the way to go. I think there are all kinds of instructional videos that you can find on YouTube.
Whose videos do you like the best?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't watch them.
You said books are not the answer.
I think that all the books I know are very, very technical.
You don't like any of the popular.
I don't read the
books
pop stuff.
You don't like the pop stuff. Okay. If somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical, you already have one PhD, to go back to school, get another PhD, write another book, what are the problems, issues that you would go back to study?
You asked me this question the last time I was on, by the way, and I said to you, probably something at the intersection of game theory and behavioral economics.
Yes.
That is still the case.
That is still the case.
I haven't changed my mind since the last time you asked me this question.
That is absolutely fair. And I'm always curious, and we've asked you this before, but let's see if it's changed. What time do you go to sleep at night and what time do you wake up in the morning?
Let's just say that I go to sleep in the wee hours of the night. Okay, in single digits.
Single digits.
Definitely single digits.
Same.
Absolutely.
And what time do you wake up?
I was going to say in double digits, but I'd be exaggerating a little bit.
But a little bit later.
Let's just say that the only place I could still catch a Shachris minion would be Chabad.
I am with you. That is the life I also like to lead. Professor Moshe Koppel, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Since I had already reached out to Professor Koppel just to kind of touch base and reintroduce him to our audience, given everything that has been going on in his life, particularly related to Israel, I figured it would also be worthwhile to ask him, what did he think about the developments that have taken place since we first spoke? Here is Professor Moshe Koppel discussing some of the developments that have taken place since our initial conversation. We spoke when the first rendition, the first iteration of ChatGPT became public. We spoke about how that will affect the world of Torah learning, some of our religious sensibilities. My interest in this topic has only grown, mostly because of the famed New York Times article with the early versions of Bing, where it seemed that the AI that Bing had presented was almost aware of itself and reached sentience. And since we have spoken, there have been other versions of ChatGPT, and the world is moving quick in this area. I'm curious, since our earlier conversation, have you adjusted any of your thoughts? Are there any trends or capabilities that you have seen AI exhibit that you did not necessarily anticipate?
Three things have changed. The first one is, well, we were at GPT-3, then GPT 3.5, then GPT-4. Now, the main difference between them, you need to think of these models as being right? It's a gigantic neural net. Think of it like the brain, right? So you've got these little nodes and there's like signals getting sent between them. It's humongous, right? Now, maybe when we talked, like the models that were being trained were trained with, we call those node parameters, okay? On order of, the early models were like 10 billion parameters, which sounds like a lot, but then very quickly went up to 100 billion parameters. And now the latest one that came out a couple of weeks ago, GPT-4, they don't say OpenAI, but it's estimated that there's about 1 trillion parameters in there. Now, it keeps getting better. The ones that are at 100 billion are way better than, the models at 100 billion, way better than that 10 billion. And GPT-4 at 1 trillion or so is way better than 100 billion in terms of the quality of the information it gives you, the quality of the answers. They have all these downstream tests that they do, right? Can you pass the bar exam? Can you pass some medical school test? Can you pass an economics final? And they're just getting better and better and better. Now, you need to understand something. Initially, in the early days of machine learning, one of the things that you worried about was when your models were too big, it means there were too many options. And there was always the fear you're training on examples, right, that you were fed in advance, and you're going to use that to apply them to new examples. The problem was that think of it as your brain too big or your model too complex or whatever, that it would overfit to your training examples, right? So it would just form these crazy hypotheses that just wrapped around your examples exactly the way they were, but then it wouldn't generalize well, right? That's called overfitting. So the assumption was if you get too big, the performance is going to tail off because it's going to overfit to your training. And that hasn't happened yet, okay? They just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it doesn't flatten out. The learning doesn't flatten out. So that's an astonishing thing. The question is, when will it flatten out? Okay, there's going to be a point, you're going to have diminishing returns on making this brain bigger, but that hasn't happened yet. So that's the first thing that happened. So the models are bigger and better. The second thing is that the whole world discovered this ChatGPT thing, and they're building apps on top of it. So you've got the basic ChatGPT, but now people are building all of these systems that incorporate ChatGPT as a component, and they can do all kinds of things. You give it a book and it will mark up the book and summarize it for you and do all kinds of things. It will write a script for a movie and then make the movie, right? GPT is generating a script, which you're then feeding into something like Stable Diffusion or one of those image creating things. And it's creating images, and you can create a series of images, and then you can generate sound using some text to voice or whatever. And people are doing wild, wild things with it. So that's the second. It's happening really fast. And the third thing that's happening, and this is probably the most important to them, people appreciate it the least. People thought, as recently as a few months ago, that the game was that OpenAI and Google and maybe a few small players like that were going to completely dominate this market because you needed tremendous computational power, tremendous resources in order to build a model like this, right? So ChatGPT ran for whatever, a year and a half or 2 years on these humongous networks of computers. So only the big guys could do it. But it turns out a model was leaked. Not the algorithm that needed to run it, but the actual model. What we do now is we use the model, but we don't actually have the model, right? But Facebook, Meta's model was leaked out. So programmers were able to sit on top of it. And it turns out that once you've got a model, you can now do all kinds of fine tuning to it and, just post-processing, where now the whole world has the full power of these models at their fingertips. It is no longer, a monopoly or a duopoly of the big guys. Once you've got something to sit on and you can start fine-tuning it, just making incremental changes and stuff, people are taking this all over the place. So, for example, OpenAI did this whole processing, they call it reinforcement learning, based on humans telling you this is an ethical answer and this is an unethical answer. And then they did this post-process. And now, if you ask some question to ChatGPT that might lead it off into doing something harmful, like telling you how to design a nuclear weapon or something like that, it won't do it, right? It recognizes these and it will not give you an answer that violates, its rules. But everybody's past that now. You can put in any rules you want in this post-processing phase. You can create an evil GPT. If we were doing this for Psak Halacha, you could do one that's always makel.
Always lenient.
Yeah, that's lenient. You could create another one that's always machmir, right? That's always stringent, right?
Not the worst idea, okay?
Yeah, that would be fun, okay? That would be fun. But you can imagine, that's harmless stuff. But you can imagine, basically,
yes,
it's a nuclear weapon that's out there and everybody is able to adapt it to their own purposes.
For some reason, and I don't know why, the question of consciousness and sentience never resonated. I don't know if it doesn't attract you, if you find it boring or outside of your area of expertise, but I am curious in that much shared New York Times article where the reporter had a conversation with the Bing chatbot, and chatbot shared its own inadequacy and fears and concerns and anxieties. Do you think that there is a notion of sentience that is taking place within these computers?
No, there's a fantastic simulation of it. That's all. I don't want to go into the weeds of philosopher John Searle's Chinese room, but the experiment, right? He imagines.
Tell us.
You get instructions, right? Somebody gives you Chinese cards and then you have instructions for which card to return and you always give appropriate answers, but that doesn't mean you understand Chinese, right? Well, you've given a computer appropriate instructions, right? It's very complicated, but it has instructions for what to say when it gets a prompt. That doesn't mean that it understands the way you understand. Now, the counter argument to this is, wait a minute, I, Moshe Koppel, do not know that you, David Bashevkin, are exactly that kind of a robot, right? I mean, I only know that you look like me and, odds are that we're all human beings and we were born the same way and, right, we're in some kind of symmetric relationship in that sense, which is different than our relationship with ChatGPT or a robot in which it might be embedded. But theoretically, I mean, I know as much about your consciousness as I do about some robot with
computers. Correct. I could be a zombie and have an empty interior world, as Professor David Chalmers has us explore. You're 100% right. These questions have always resonated with me. You didn't know it at the time, but the conversation that we're introducing is part of a series that is actually on prayer, because to me, the religious Turing test that we're involved in every day is the act of prayer. It's what gets us in touch with our very humanity, what makes us most human. And I was wondering, what do you think is the key to our humanity? What makes us most human? If we're being outpaced in our ability to play chess and complete the bar exam and pass the medical boards, where do you turn to, Moshe Koppel, when you try to get in touch with your humanity? What makes you human, different than a computer? You'll never be more efficient than a computer, I assume. So where now do you think we should be turning to really get in touch and access our humanity?
No, but you asked me approximately the most difficult question in the history of mankind at the tail end of an addendum. Now we're talking about AI. So thanks for that, David. Let me ask that question to you. Do you have an answer to it?
I mean, I'm talking about it in the course of this series. I genuinely believe our impulse to prayer is an act of getting in touch with our consciousness, which I'm a little bit of a pan-psychism, where I believe that consciousness is the ether in which the entire world is formed. And I genuinely believe that when I daven, when I close my eyes and try to get in touch with my own inner wants and desires and just the difficulties and the opportunities of the world, that in and of itself is what I believe makes us most human. That impulse, that inner impulse. I'm not saying the words of Ashrei that you say before Mincha. I'm not saying the specific halachic formulation.
Right.
But the pre-halachic impulse of prayer that predates Sinai, that to me is where I return to, almost that like inner chauffeur, that unarticulated impulse and desire. I think our definition of humanity, rightfully so, needs to change. And I think this is a time of great opportunity for religious thinkers, religious ritual, religious act to kind of reclaim what it means to be human. Do you care to either push back?
That was a beautiful answer, David, and I'm not going to try to go you one better.
Okay, I very much appreciate it. I'm going to let you off the hook for your friendship, for your kindness, and most of all, for your Torah Torah works. It really means a lot to count you as a mentor and a friend, and really appreciate your time today.
I appreciate it very much. Happy to be here.
I hope in many ways that AI changes our relationship to Torah. I think that it can change our relationship to Torah in very good and very healthy ways. And I'll list two of them, and they both relate to things that I surfaced in the introduction, returning back to that story of Funes the Memorious, and thinking about a world where imagine we remembered everything. Imagine you never forgot anything that you read. It was always at your fingertips. Imagine that you're able to recall every line of Talmud that you studied, every word of Torah that you've ever read. It needs to be more, I've heard Rav Schachter say many times that certain people, they're big Talmidei Chachamim during the week and they're Amaratzim on Shabbos. And what he is jokingly referring to is during the week, they're able to have, computers and databases at their fingertips which they're able to search. And on Shabbos, when they're unable to have that, they know nothing. And obviously, I think even if we had a way to skirt around that, even if we were able to remember and have everything at our fingertips on Shabbos, I kind of hope that AI changes our relationship to Torah, and I hope that it is in two ways. One of which, in a world where we could remember everything, I think that it requires even more so the need to build new doorways, new analogies, new reference points into Torah. I'm not just talking about a hook. I'm talking about new ways that Torah is resonant in our lives. It reminds me of a Torah that I've quoted many times from Reb Tzadok, where Reb Tzadok says that the Gemara, the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah, which says Yiftach B'doro Kishmuel B'doro. Yiftach was one of the great judges in the book of Judges. Yiftach in his generation was like Shmuel in his generation. And what Reb Tzadok says is that Yiftach is not just a person, it's not just a noun, it is also a verb. Yiftach, someone who is able to be poseach, to open up new doorways into religious thinking, religious ideas, religious experiences. That is religious leadership. That is the Shmuel Hanavi, Shmuel, the great prophet of his generation. And I think when it comes to Torah, building new entry points into Torah, building new connections into Torah, more creativity, more deep conceptual thinking about how Torah informs the very interiority of our lives, I think is a new frontier. It's something that I try to do. I don't know that I do it successfully, but it's definitely something that I try to do. The essays that I write, those of you who follow me outside of 1840 know that I write essays on Talmud for Tablet Magazine. I'm not writing for the initiated. I'm trying to build new doorways, new entry points to think about a tractate Sota, a tractate Yevamos, a tractate Chagiga, areas of Torah that were previously cordoned off with a kind of a mechitza, a barrier of entry for somebody who maybe doesn't have the right background, and be able to think about thematically, what is this about? How does this resonate in my life? I think there are really incredible opportunities in whichever way. I try in that way, and I see such incredible work happening in other areas. But instead of just kind of like, I don't know, we have Bar-Ilan, we have Sefaria. There's a great article by Zev Elef that he wrote in the Layer House entitled Digital Discourse and the Democratization of Jewish Learning, which really asks this question of like, if we're able to remember everything and have things at our fingertips, then Talmud Torah should be more than just memory. It should be more than just trying not to forget. It should be building new doorways into our lives, into the lives of other people, to think about Torah in new ways. That's number one. And I think number two brings us back to our very topic. And our larger topic, which wasn't at the center of the conversation today, is the topic of prayer. And it is well known, and this is something that I discussed with Reb David Weinberg, that Rabbi Nachman used to turn his Torah into tefillah. He used to literally make prayers out of his Torah ideas. And this is something that Reb David, if you listen to that interview, said himself and did himself in his own work, A Birth of the Spoken Word. But I think it's really so much more than that. What does it mean to take your Torah and turn it into a tefillah? I think it means constructing Torah ideas that address the very existential questions of our lives. What Reb Tzadok talks about in Tzidkas HaTzadik in the 211th paragraph, Rav Tzadok writes that Torah and tefillah, prayer and Torah ideas, they need one another. We're supposed to daven in the same place that we learn. And the way that Rav Tzadok talks about it is Torah is about creative production, almost about leaning into our sense of self, our ego, our creative powers, our perspicacity, a word that I really only know from a Simpsons episode. Lisa says that, I'm losing my perspicacity. All of the things that make us unique and make us special. And Rav Tzadok writes that that tefillah, prayer, davening, does the exact opposite. It is about our vulnerabilities, our wants, our needs, the fact that we are inadequate and insecure. And those two kind of link up together, and one fulfills the other. If you just have Torah, you're going to walk around feeling that sense of accomplishment, that sense of superiority, which the Talmud itself describes and warns us of walking around with that sense of entitlement and proudness that Torah accomplishment often leads to. While prayer is about leaning into and focusing our needs and vulnerabilities before God, before the Melech Malchei Hamlachim, the King of all kings. And I think that in a world where we can remember everything, what we really need to focus on is what we're able to internalize. It's incredibly cliche. It's a story that so many people know and quote, but it's a famous story where somebody approached the Kotzker Rebbe and said, I finished all of Shas. I've been through all of Shas. Shas, of course, referring to the corpus of Shisha Sidrei, the Shisha Siddharim of the Talmud, and he felt very accomplished. And the Kotzker famously responded back, you've been through Shas, but has Shas been through you? And it's a great remark. It's a classic line for the Kotzker. I'm sure many of our listeners have heard this. What does it mean, has Torah been through you? I think the only avenue to create a world where Torah is able to penetrate the recesses of who we are, our religious character, our sense of self, is by uniting the world of Torah and tefillah, having silent prayers in a moment where nobody else can see, moments of real sincerity in our lives where we ask for things, where we ask for ideas to be embodied in our lives, where we ask to Torah to seep into the recesses of who we are and actually transform our character. It's that world where the Chazon Ish himself, Rav Yeshaya Kohelet, in his second letter, he writes explicitly, Halimud v'hatfila keshurim zeh b'zeh. Torah and davening, Torah and prayer are integrated, are reliant, are dependent on one another. And I think that dependency is about learning how to take our creativity, our accomplishments, and unite it with our vulnerability. To have the ideas that we produce that inspire, that nourish us, really address those inner vulnerabilities that we carry with us in the recesses of our heart. And that is the world where Torah and tefillah, prayer, and our Torah accomplishments are constantly in dialogue, fulfilling one another, keshurim zeh b'zeh, entirely reliant and dependent, informing and nourishing each of these respective worlds. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our dearest friend, Dina Emerson. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 917-720-5629. Once again, that number is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18 followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.